Imagine that you are an elderly person who is homebound in LA and who wants to join a nonviolent blockade in the halls of Congress in support of healthcare in Washington, D.C., because you no longer feel that signing petitions is enough. Or perhaps you are working two low-wage jobs to feed your family and you cannot join your sisters and brothers at a non-violent sit-in in the lobby of the bank that foreclosed your home. What can you do? We say you can join a virtual sit-in. You can join in an online protest that connects your data body and your body in an act of electronic civil disobedience. As Henry David Thoreau called for in 1849, let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. At the start of 1998, a group of artists who called themselves the Electronic Disturbance Theater initiated a year-long performance against the Mexican government and in support of the Zapatista communities in Chiapas, Mexico, who were shouting, "Ya basta, enough is enough," across the arcs of the realities against the savage neoliberal globalization that threatened to destroy their indigenous communities standing in its way. This group of artists created the first automated virtual sit-in tool called FloodNet to support the Zapatista struggle. We were not hackers. We were not activists. We were artists exploring the new possibilities of bodies online, of a new type of recombinant theater that would shift the anonymous aesthetics of the 1990s into a space of radical transparency. We would not hide who we were, where we were, what we were going to do. Our art and our code was not hidden. We were Brett Stalbuam, Carmin Karasic, Stefan Wray, and myself. We ended our year-long performance with a virtual sit-in on the U.S. Department of Defense for selling weapons to the Mexican army to use against the Zapatista communities. The Department of Defense launched the first known info weapon, as they called it, and we ended up on the front page of the New York Times on October 31st, 1998. And we got a great review from the Department of Defense. If the Electronic Disturbance Theater wasn't illegal, it was certainly immoral. It is important to point out that the DoD's review frames our work as an aesthetic gesture and not as hackers or activists. Our art forced the DoD and other entities to consider the definition of electronic civil disobedience not as cyber war, cyber terrorism, or cyber crime, but as performance art, net art, and a reflection of the history of nonviolent direct action. They could no longer speak about the law and technology, but instead they had to speak about art, justice, and the poetics of social forms of action. But this tale of electronic disturbance really starts with another collective of artists I had the opportunity to work with during the 1980s in Tallahassee, Florida, Critical Art Ensemble. As a young artist, we began to imagine that new forms of capital were being assembled around us, and that these forms would rise to power rapidly in the 1990s. They would be virtual capitalisms, clone capitalisms, or genomic capitalisms, and particle capitalisms, or nanotech-driven capitalisms. These new forms of power called for radical artistic practices that would create disturbances or artivist interventions that hackers and street activists in the 1980s did not have time to consider or develop. Critical Art Ensemble attempted to frame the virtual geography that was headed our way, where only data bodies would have value and real bodies would become virtual roadkill. Critical Art Ensemble established the theory of electronic civil disobedience based on our explorations of street-based disturbances or micro-gestures like playing with commodities we had just bought at the mall, right in front of the mall, and not going home to play with them. It did not take long for mall police to respond. Play with your commodities at home like a good consumer. To do otherwise is perverse, and it will be stopped. We quickly came to understand that a disturbance does not have to be very big for power to respond and walk into the performative matrix to do its thing. Our work with ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power in Tallahassee, I happen to be a coordinator for it, would teach us about having theory hit the ground and how to trespass and block the flows of power and redirect it. ACT UP would teach us about the tactics and strategies of civil disobedience, a force greater than power. This theme was later developed by Electronic Disturbance Theater. Electronic civil disobedience for Electronic Disturbance Theater was always about crossing the borders, the divide between data bodies and real bodies, and connecting them in a radically transparent way, not as sites of communication and documentation, but as the poetics of nonviolent direct action. Now, in 2013, the art-based theories of critical art ensemble and the performances by Electronic Disturbance Theater have established electronic civil disobedience as part of the language of a new generation of hacktivist practices that are being taught at schools and used by different protest communities around the world. But let's jump over to another border. As a professor living near the Mexico-US border since 2004, it became apparent that the killing zone of the state-sponsored aesthetic project called The Border had to be disturbed. But how? That was the question. Perhaps by hacking the border to pieces, or better yet, dissolving the border. Again, I was very lucky to be working side by side with my longtime collaborator, artist Brett Stalbuam, who just happens to teach at UCSD with me. As we sat having coffee by a giant stone teddy bear in 2007, Brett mentioned his continuing investigation of GPS practices among artists and his own virtual hiker algorithm. And his partner, artist Paula Poole, do dangerous desert hikes without getting lost, and that would prefabricate routes across these landscapes. Suddenly, we were struck with the possibility of relocating this walking tool on the border, where death pursues and catches immigrants crossing the Devil's Highway by the hundreds. Thus, the Trans-Border Immigrant Tool was born. The Trans-Border Immigrant Tool would be a rudimentary GPS applet built on the Motorola's, on my Motorola's 355 series for under $40 starting in 2007. We envisioned the Trans-Border Immigrant Tool as an effective poetic gesture. The Trans-Border Immigrant Tool would enable anyone walking across this desert of the real to locate the nearest water station left by NGOs like Water Station Inc. and Border Angels on the north side of the border. The tool would not only lead the lost and thirsty to water, but also carry experimental poetry in multiple languages as part of its architecture. A poetry that would offer tactics about survival in the desert and conceptual considerations of what it means to be a trans-border body now. We always imagine immigrants as bare life, with little to no sense of the poetic and the expanded post-contemporary algorithms of culture all around us. For Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0, the question of sustenance, of quenching thirst, of quenching intellect, of quenching the spirit of trans-border bodies as conceptual figures who have the intellect to understand the world around them on multiple scales became the core of our gesture. This concern with poetic sustenance shifted the technical fetish of the project from being about the use of the global positioning system and instead about the creation of a geopoetic system for trans-border bodies. This dislocation of GPS technology would become extraordinarily important when Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0 would become the target of Republican members of the US Congress, Fox News, Glenn Beck, the FBI, and my own school, UCSD, as it became a target and named a traitorous application in 2010. Each of the artists involved in Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0, Brett Stalbuam, Misha Cardenas, Dr. Amy Sarah Carroll from the University of Michigan, and Elie Mermod, would come under investigation and violent harassment. In the end, we were cleared of any potential charges, and the translucent poetics of the trans-border immigrant tool and its code, its words, and its performance continues to dissolve the border. Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0 continues to disturb network borders, art borders, particle borders, institutional and national borders by conjuring a geo-aesthetic meets geoethics against the boundaries which crisscross every single body on the planet. We imagine a geo-aesthetics that connects both the human and the inhuman, geography and ethics, technology and those without networks. We imagine a geoaesthetics that crosses into and dislocates the fog of geospatial mobility and rallies ethical objects and multiple forms of sustenance. Our projects conspire to connect real bodies to data bodies as interventions for future and present trans-border bodies, to disturb the atmospheric conditions of post 9/11 insecurities, and to always create art that recalls the song of the Zapatistas. We do not move at the speed of technology, but at the speed of dreams. Zapata vive, la lucha sigue. Muchas gracias.